Hey there folks, the video you're about to watch is getting a little old now. I think I made it in the spring of 2024, but I kept it as a Patreon only video for quite some time. I mainly did that because this video is quite unlike most of the others I've done. It's about a body of research rather than an in-depth analysis of a single case. I'm sure I'll receive a little backlash from some people, but you can't always make everyone happy. The reason I made it was to answer questions I've consistently gotten regarding Missing 411 and my opinion on it. It's something that's been asked of me so many times that I thought it was necessary to build an in-depth answer to it. That's this video. I imagine by now most of my subscribers will be surprised by absolutely nothing in this. But you still may find it interesting as it covers a lot of cases in quick succession, and many of them I've never talked about before. I did edit out a lot of the original intro because it was way too long. It was like 15 minutes of me explaining why I made this video. I think I can sum up the cuts a lot quicker by simply saying I don't want to be pointing out anyone else's mistakes or errors without acknowledging my own, because I've made plenty, especially in the early days of this channel. I'll just throw a list of mine in the description. Also, I was a big believer in Missing 411 back when I started all this. If you've been around since the beginning, you know that. My early stuff is riddled with Bigfoot and the paranormal. It wasn't until I really started doing in-depth research on some of these Missing 411 cases that I kind of became red-pilled to the fact that they're just not as strange or unusual as I thought they were. There was a gradual turn from believer to more of a skeptic, and it was not intentional. Anyway, I'll stop yapping for now. Let's get to the video. Hey there folks, this is a video I wasn't sure I'd ever make, but at some point it almost feels unfair to you, the viewer, if I don't. From the very beginning of this channel I've gotten comments or emails asking questions about Missing 411. Now these questions or comments have certainly evolved over time. Nowadays it seems to manifest as, why do you bash Missing 411? I realize that people get these misconceptions because I've always kind of tiptoed around the subject of Missing 411 because I don't want anyone who is a fan to feel like they have to pick a side. But at a certain point it almost feels irresponsible to not talk about Missing 411 directly because it is so many people's introduction into the missing person genre. I certainly give credit to Missing 411 and David Paulides for popularizing the genre of strange missing persons cases. Now, just in case some viewers have no idea what Missing 411 is, it is essentially a body of work created by David Paulides in the form of books and movies that presents a long list of missing persons cases that are supposed to be mysterious, unexplainable, or maybe even paranormal. It is a hugely popular subject with a large and dedicated fan base. I was a big fan for a long time. I always felt that David Paulides came across as a very sincere and trustworthy individual. The cases presented in Missing 411 claim to be selected based on a set of exclusionary criteria, meaning that the presence of any one of these items, mental illness, voluntary disappearance, criminal activity, animal predation, would disqualify a case from being included under the Missing 411 umbrella. This list is important, and we will return to it. Now, generally, the cases have an air of mystery about them, and with that said, this channel has never been about bashing Missing 411, and this video is not intended to do that either. When you know people believe in stories that are verifiably inaccurate, do you do nothing because the people seem to like, enjoy, and trust the source? Or do you try to show them the evidence they're not seeing, even if it's uncomfortable? I guess in this video I'm trying to do the latter. The end goal of this video is not to get people to stop reading, watching, or listening to Missing 411. In fact, I think you should do those things. Get information from every source you can. And if my point of view is considered the skeptical one, I would encourage you to seek out the opposite. See whose information makes more sense to you. It's always important to know the arguments of the other side. So if you're wondering what I personally think about Missing 411, because it's a question I often get, well, my answer is that I have a lot of concerns. These concerns revolve solely around the way information is portrayed in Missing 411 and other information that is not mentioned at all. So I'll come right out and say, I don't believe in Missing 411. What does that mean? It means I don't believe that the long list of cases presented in Missing 411 as having strange, paranormal, or unexplainable elements are all legitimate. Now, there are some genuinely strange and unexplainable cases in the Missing 411 archive, but it is my contention that the vast majority of these cases do not even meet Missing 411's own standards for qualifying a case. People also ask why I don't like David Paulides. The simple answer is, I don't like nor dislike him. I don't know him. This video is not going to be about David Paulides as a person. It's going to be about his research. So this is not intended to be an indictment of him, so much as the information presented in his books and movies. And criticism of research is essential for refinement of future research into the missing persons genre. If someone builds off the work I have done, and learns new details or develops new theories I haven't thought of, then that is a good thing. It is refining the understanding of whatever case that is. In this video, we are going to go over a bunch of cases, some I've previously covered, and even some I haven't made videos on, but that I've researched independently. That way, you can see why I don't believe in Missing 411, and then you can judge for yourself whether that's a reasonable position to hold or not. And I'll also have a public video I can just link to all the people who ask me questions about what I think about Missing 411. So I will walk you through the exact same things I went through, case by case, and you can see if you come out the other end feeling the same. You're getting the crash course in this video. Throughout, I'm going to do my best to show you the sources for everything, so that you don't have to take my word for anything. You can go look at it yourself, which I strongly encourage you to do. Anyway, now that we have that long-winded preamble out of the way, let's go over some Missing 411 cases that I think shouldn't be Missing 411 cases. So, one of the main issues I have with these cases is that some of them seem to heavily skew in the direction of making a case seem paranormal by hinting at the possibility of something like a cryptid or UFOs being involved. And to be honest, I've often felt that Bigfoot is being inferred in many of these cases, but perhaps that's only because I was aware Paulides was a Bigfoot researcher before starting Missing 411. Let me show you what I mean. Jackie Copeland. I covered the case of Jackie Copeland some time ago. It was an incident back in May of 1950. He was a 2-year-old boy spending the day with his family in Pleasantville, Pennsylvania. At some point, Jackie wandered off. Now, Jackie's father worked for an oil company, and his family was staying on land leased from the company. Once Jackie was reported missing, a ton of people came in to assist in the search, including many volunteers from the oil company. Fortunately, Jackie was found quickly and returned to his family. But the important part in the Missing 411 book that I want to draw your attention to is this quote. An article in the Logansport Press, dated May 17, 1950, had an interview with the Copelands and heard Jackie's rendition of what occurred during his night in the woods. The press wanted to hear how the boy got to his location in the swamp, what he had to drink or eat, and how he kept warm. Jackie first was asked why he left the picnic, and here is his quote. He saw something peering at him from behind a big tree. When he approached, the creature scampered into the brush. Jackie didn't explain anything more about leaving the picnic at that point. The article goes on to say, he recounted in child talk his adventure in an awful blackness, peopled by a great throbbing giant and a tall friendly tree, and wild animals howling in the distance, and the unfamiliar shouts of strangers prowling nearby. Okay, so when you hear those excerpts, what comes to mind? Obviously, it's not very descriptive, but it might evoke some kind of image in your mind. The child sees a creature watching him that runs off into the brush, and shortly thereafter, young Jackie goes missing. Later, he encounters a great throbbing giant. It gives the case an added element of something creepy or paranormal. But the paragraph I just read to you from Missing 411 takes the newspaper article almost entirely out of context. Let's look at the same Logansport Press article that Paulides referenced and compare the two. The search went on all night. Then about 9 o'clock, an oil field worker dropped out of a group of searchers to go to a nearby pump house to make some adjustments in the machinery. He saw something peering at him from behind a big tree. When he approached, the creature scampered into the brush. It was a badly frightened, oil-smeared little Jackie. By now you're probably going, wait, what? But that's right. The actual newspaper reference for this story has an entirely different context. While the missing 411 version somehow attributes this description to Jackie Copeland telling the story of how he disappeared, the newspaper is actually telling the tale of the searcher who found an oil-smeared Jackie Copeland, hiding behind a tree and scampering into the brush. Nobody saw any creature. Jackie was the supposed creature. The issue here is that the missing 411 book quotes 2 sentences out of an entire paragraph that is telling a story. Now, if we give the benefit of the doubt and say this mishap is entirely by accident, then what are the chances that this accident also happens to make the story more mysterious, creepy, or paranormal? Something to think about. And if you're stuck on the actual description that Jackie gave of the awful blackness, the throbbing giant, and the tall friendly tree, let's remember that Jackie was 2 years old when this happened. Let's talk about the case of Eloise Lindsay. Let me preface this by saying that Paulides writes that this case is definitely one of the strangest stories in the entire book. Let's see. 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay disappeared in 1989 in Table Rock State Park, South Carolina. This is another case I've covered on the channel back in the day, and probably not very well either, but I never focused on the discrepancies. If you read the missing 411 Eastern U.S. version of the story starting on page 133, the story goes something like this. Eloise was on a long hike doing 7 days alone before meeting a friend. On the 3rd day of her hike, she started being followed by a group of men who meant to harm her. Eloise drops her backpack and equipment and runs off trail to try and avoid these men. She was eventually found in a delirious state by a hunter after 16 days missing. Afterwards, she was taken to safety, but up until the moment she was found, she claimed that she was being chased through the woods by a group of men she never saw. She then told her story to reporters from her hospital bed. Paulides finishes the story by saying, quote, "My question for Eloise and her mother is, what did the girl see? Her mother indicates she saw something, and what she saw is something that she obviously does not want to make public, for whatever reason." At the end of Eloise Lindsay's story, Paulides refers the reader to the Dennis Martin case and the existence of the fabled wild men that live in the Smokies, obviously making a connection between what Eloise experienced and the supposed feral wild men from the Dennis Martin case. And don't worry, we'll hit the Dennis Martin case. The main takeaway from the missing 411 presentation of this case is this. Eloise was stalked by some strange and shadowy people for over 2 weeks. There is no mention of the group of men ever doing anything other than silently following Eloise in the woods, and the only speculation Paulides puts forth about who they could be is the supposed wild men. Why does this matter? Well, let's look at the reporting at the time. Miss Lindsay said she knew rescuers were searching for her, but also believed men working in the area were bent on harming her. She said the men had dogs, monitors for tracking down living animals, whistles, guns, tractors, cars, mopeds, boats. I feel like if they had been part of the search party, they would have been calling out, "Eloise, we're here to get you." At some points, they came very close to finding me, but it was never at the right time. Other articles mention that Eloise could hear the men using walkie-talkies and even talking about her. If you read the articles, you get the sense that Eloise may be suffering from some sort of mental illness. She went in for a psych evaluation after she left the hospital. It really seems like she was perhaps paranoid and eventually determined that the searchers were actually men out to cause her harm. The main question is, why doesn't Missing 411 mention any of this? Is it because you can't push a feral wild man theory if the missing person says that they were being chased by cars, mopeds, and boats? Seriously consider what it does to the perception of a case when you say she was being chased by mysterious men she never saw, versus she knew searchers were in the area, but she felt she was being chased by men using dogs, guns, tractors, cars, mopeds, and boats. The two scenarios give off very different vibes, one that's mysterious and one that's not at all. In the end, This case should have been excluded due to mental illness. Karen Cooney. Karen Cooney was a 15-year-old girl in Corey, Pennsylvania, who disappeared in 1968. The missing 411 story goes that Karen was in her backyard doing chores when her family heard her scream. When they went to check on her, Karen had vanished. A search was initiated, and a little over a day later, Karen was found in a dazed state. She told authorities she was chased from her home by a big man with a knife, who followed her into the woods a long ways until she fell asleep. Again, a story of someone being chased through the woods. So what's the deal with this case? Well, let's read some additional information that newspapers talked about. You see, authorities quickly found out that Karen was making things up. The FBI got involved when there was allegations of kidnapping, and when the state police talked to her, she told them that she had been very nervous and high-strung lately, and decided to go for a walk in the woods near her home. Her scream, which triggered the theory that Karen may have been kidnapped as she was hanging the family wash, occurred when she entered a wooded area and had to cross an electric fence, which shocked her. So the whole Karen Cooney story is kind of just a fabrication. But in the same Missing 411 book, Politis compares this case to that of Eloise Lindsay, saying, "This case is not the only case in which strange-looking men are described in the woods associated with a disappearance." He then refers to Eloise's story and ends the paragraph with, "It's an odd coincidence that both Eloise Lindsay and Karen Cooney describe being chased by men and they don't or won't supply descriptions. Why? Is it just me, or are both those sentences kind of contradictory? Anyway, we actually know that Eloise did describe the people chasing her, almost too well, while Karen was just never chased at all. But these cases in Missing 411 work to create a narrative that there are these strange people in the woods. The Karen Cooney case should have been excluded due to voluntary disappearance. Let's talk Kevin Dye. Kevin Dye was a 9-year-old boy who disappeared in 1971 from a cabin in Wyoming. Missing 411 mentions that Kevin is disabled, but doesn't go into detail about just how disabled he is. Kevin was playing ping pong outside with family when the ball was hit out into the trees and brush. Naturally, Kevin chased after the ball. He ran into the woods and did not return. A search began, and some searchers said that they saw Kevin, but he ran off into the woods. Food was left out for him and was taken quickly, with no culprit having been found. Searchers also found a lean-to shelter made of pine boughs, as well as some stick and stone constructions that his parents said looked like the stuff that Kevin would make. Kevin was actually found after 11 days alongside a creek, laying down exhausted. He had lost 20 pounds, a quarter of his body weight, and a doctor said that he believed Kevin ate nothing the entire time. The Missing 411 entry ends by saying that Kevin was not telling anyone what happened during his time in the woods. Keep that last sentence in mind for just a minute. Now, to me, this case isn't very strange to begin with, but it gets even less strange when you learn that Kevin was so disabled that he couldn't really speak at all. He was barely communicative, but he had more energy than any kid we can probably imagine. One newspaper said that he had the physical condition of a top athlete, but who can become a screaming, flailing animal when he fails to make himself understood. In fact, the newspapers report that Kevin was so hyperactive that his parents had to give him 9 tranquilizers a day, and it still wasn't enough. This poor kid was so unbelievably energetic that they had to give him enough meds to kill a horse, and it still didn't work. Is it any wonder that he just ran off into the forest? His parents said that their yelling and screaming for him probably drove him into the forest even more. All of the constructs that were found in the forest were probably Kevin, as confirmed by the parents, and the missing food was probably Kevin as well. You see, the doctor assumed Kevin didn't eat because he lost so much weight. But consider that we have an ultra-hyperactive kid who is now off his 9 tranquilizers a day. This kid was probably burning many thousands of calories per day while lost. Even with some food, he still would have lost that weight. There was also some local people who reported that they had break-ins at their cabins where someone stole their jars of peanut butter. As it turns out, peanut butter was Kevin's favorite food. It seems readily apparent to me that this hyperactive child spent 10 to 11 days running around building things and stealing peanut butter until he eventually lost a quarter of his body weight, at which point he finally collapsed and was found by searchers. I'm not sure why this is a missing 411 case. It should have been excluded based on mental illness. Moving on, I know Missing 411 has often made mention of the children who disappear and show up many miles away, or are found at incredible elevations. Okay, if true, it also sounds amazing to me. So let's take a look at some of those cases. I got this list from Missing 411, Devils in the Details, page 362. This is a list of missing people by distance traveled. So let's look at the number 1 on that list, Jack Hodges, who apparently traveled 50 miles at only 7 years old. Here's the story. Jack Hodges. 7-year-old Jack Hodges was with his family visiting a ranch 30 miles to the north of the city of Seligman in northern Arizona. At some point, and for some reason, Jack disappeared along with his dog. The dog returned a few hours later, but there was no Jack. A search was immediately initiated to try and find the boy, as temperatures in the area were getting down to 14 degrees at night. 2 days into the search, Jack was found by 2 cowboys on the slopes of Mount Floyd, which lies about 10 miles to the northeast of Seligman. A newspaper article referenced in Missing 411 states, "Searchers estimated the warmly clad youngster must have walked some 50 miles, mostly in circles." Jack was in relatively good condition. He was taken to a hospital and released a day later. Paulides ends Jack's case with these lines, "I will continue to present these cases to exemplify a point. We can't ignore what seems illogical. We can't attempt to reconcile in our minds what seems uncomfortable to believe." Some pretty cryptic words there. Paulides makes a point to say that there was no water in the area, and that only a little snow was on the mountain. He states that the idea that Jack could have eaten this snow does not make sense. Keep that last part in mind. Paulides says it makes no sense that Jack could have eaten snow. So what's the reality of this situation? Did little Jack Hodges really walk 50 miles in 2 days? Probably not. Let's think about it. This is literally just something a searcher told a newspaper, and for who knows what reason, and he was probably exaggerating. Jack disappeared from a ranch that was about 30 miles north of Seligman, and was found at a location about 10 miles northeast of Seligman. Jack could have walked 20 to 25 miles in order to get to Mount Floyd. I'll also add that one newspaper says that Jack was found near Mount Floyd, in an area about 20 miles north of Seligman. If accurate, Jack would have only been 10 miles away from the ranch that he disappeared from. But, believe it or not, the distance is totally besides the point in this case. It's literally not an issue at all. Even if he did walk 50 miles, it still would be virtually irrelevant. Unbelievably impressive, yes, but irrelevant. You might notice that in the Missing 411 book, there's no quotes sharing what Jack had to say regarding his disappearance. This gives the story its air of mystery. What could have happened to him while he was lost that he traveled an impossible 50 miles? And this also might lead you to think that he said nothing at all about the incident. But Jack Hodges told his story to reporters, and it sheds a lot of light on things. When asked how he survived the freezing temperatures of the waste, Jack responded, "I curled up under a tree and slept all night." Remember, Jack was warmly clad. He goes on to say that he was taking his dog on a long walk and just kept walking after leaving the ranch. Jack continued, "I saw a deer and antelope, but I didn't have a gun. I ate dirty snow that was on the north side of the mountain." Oops. You see, Jack is clearly not like your modern Gen Alpha child. This is a rough, gruff 1950s country boy who wanted to turn his disappearance into a little hunting trip. I'm starting to think he just breezed through the 50 miles after all. He slept under a tree, he wished he had a gun to hunt some game, and he ate mountain snow for water. The point here is, do you think this should be a Missing 411 case? The child told his story, And it didn't involve aliens or Bigfoot or any mystery at all, really. Jack himself never asserted he walked 50 miles. This is merely the story of a tough kid who got lost for 2 days. While we're on the subject, let's talk about another even more incredible distance story that for some reason didn't make the list in Devils in the Details, even though the distance traveled was stated to be 75 miles. Let's talk about the daughters of John Hammond. In May of 1891, the 4- and 8-year-old daughters of John Hammond left their home 6 miles north of the town of Thetford to go visit their sister who lived a mile away. They visited their sister and then began walking home. They never made it back. A large search was initiated to find the 2 girls. On the 4th day of searching, they found the youngest girl unconscious but still alive. She was found 15 miles from the point she disappeared. This was good, but they still had to find the other sister. She was found on the 10th day of the search, but unfortunately she was already deceased. The Missing 411 book quotes an article that says the girl was found 10 miles north of Running, Blaine County, fully 75 miles from the place where the children lost their way. That is quite incredible if true. So let's have a look at the newspaper in question. Now, incidentally, that quote I just shared from Missing 411 actually has a typo, as the newspaper does not state the girl was found north of Running, but actually a town called Dunning. So we know where the girl left from and where she ended up. She started 6 miles north of Thetford and ended up 10 miles north of Dunning. Now, as the crow flies, that distance is about 25 miles. Obviously, she likely didn't walk a straight line, so the distance is more, but the idea that this girl walked 75 miles is completely unconfirmed and highly unlikely. Why couldn't she have walked 30 miles across the 10 days she was missing? My main point here is that this 75 miles number is entirely fabricated and totally unreliable. It comes from one newspaper article that just got reprinted by all the other newspapers. This case could very well qualify as a Missing 411 case. It has that element of mystery where we don't know why they disappeared, but the supposed eye-catching fact, this 75 miles, is more than likely a typo or something. Reliability in newspapers from the 1800s has always been an issue. How would anyone know she walked 75 miles instead of 25? There was simply no way to confirm that unless they followed tracks for 75 miles, which I can guarantee did not happen. So those are 2 of the largest distances traveled by children in Missing 411 cases, and it is apparent to me after researching them that those distances were not verifiably traveled, and also highly unlikely in each situation. I don't want to beat a dead horse with this, but I feel like I have to throw an elevation one in here just to satisfy everyone, so let's do that. Going back to the Devils in the Details book on page 361, we have a list of children who covered great elevation. Obviously, let's go to the top of the list, which is Jill Hatch, who traveled up 3,500 feet in elevation at 7 years old. Already, it sounds like a supernatural feat, so let's see what the story is. Jill Hatch. In 1957, Jill Hatch was 7 years old when she left her home with her parents to go on a camping trip in Camp Shydeck, California. Camp Shydeck is a small town that sits kind of near the base of Reyes Peak, which towers over the area at 7,500 feet in elevation. Camp Shydeck sits at about 3,800 feet in elevation. Keep those 2 numbers in mind here. Anyway, while on the trip, Jill went out with her father to do some fishing along with her dog. The dad spent some time fishing while Jill and the dog were just sitting nearby. When he was done, he went to grab Jill, only to find that both her and the dog were gone. A search was immediately started for Jill, but only the dog was found after it returned to camp on its own. Missing 411 states that 28 hours after Jill disappeared, searchers were near the summit of Reyes Peak and descending when they saw Jill on the side of a hill 7,500 feet up, which is essentially at the very top of Reyes Peak, and she was lying in fresh snow. Politis states that Jill was found 5 miles from her camp and 3,500 feet up in elevation, a truly incredible distance. Unfortunately, Jill was already dead from exposure when they found her. She would have had to cross 2 steep ridges to reach this point. So what's the problem with this one, you might ask? Well, To start, I have no idea where Paulides got this story of searchers coming down from Reyes Peak and somehow finding Jill up there near the top. He cites no source. And just think about it. Why would searchers even be up there looking for a small child? Almost every article you find on Jill Hatch's case says that she was found between half a mile to a mile and a half from camp. I looked at a ton of articles on this case, and only one claims she was found 5 miles away. But the problem with the 5 miles figure is that it doesn't make sense. 5 miles from Camp Schiedek puts you past Reyes Peak. But even if you accept this anomalous figure, the story told in this article is completely different from Missing 411. It says her body was found huddled in some bushes, not laying on the snow at the top of Reyes Peak. The most important newspaper I've found on this case comes from the Ventura County Star, which actually shares details from those who found her. Russell Princeton, a butcher from New Cuyama, was one of the searchers covering a hillside above the creek, making his way over snow-covered rocks and brush when he came upon the little, limp body of the girl. She apparently had begun to make her way up the slope where she could see greater distance when exhaustion overcame her and, sleepy from the bitter cold, slumped down in the snow and collapsed. Reading a little earlier in the article, we learn that this searcher was in Snail Canyon when he found Jill Hatch. So he was covering the hillside above the creek in Snail Canyon, not climbing to the top of Reyes Peak. Let's look at where Snail Canyon is in relation to Camp Schiedek. The highlighted area is Snail Canyon, and it does not extend southward more than about 2.5 miles from Camp Schiedek. But keep in mind that Jill was found about half a mile to 1.5 miles from the camp, so she wasn't very deep into the canyon, which coincidentally agrees with what 99% of newspapers say about where Jill was found. It also means Jill could not have climbed higher than the canyon walls, let's say 1,000 feet. But judging by the article of the fellow who found her, she died very shortly after even attempting to climb up the sides of the canyon. So the total elevation Jill climbed is likely next to nothing, and certainly not even close to 3,500 feet. In my opinion, the story as told in Missing 411 uses cherry-picked numbers and also does not cite a source for Jill being found at the top of Reyes Peak. The only newspaper report that even remotely sounded like what's written in Missing 411 describes 2 male searchers who were coming down a slope when they spotted Jill lying on the snow. One of them also had the last name Princeton, and I bet he's the son of the man who gave a much better description of the discovery. Neither iterations describe the searchers being atop Reyes Peak. It simply doesn't make sense, and Jill Hatch's case represents absolutely nothing in terms of elevation climbed by a child. Let's talk about Dennis Martin. I know fans of the channel probably don't need a Dennis Martin refresher. I have a lot of videos on the subject, but it is a hugely important case because the Missing 411 version of this story has been told 1,000 times on various radio programs and other venues. And I would venture a guess that the majority of people familiar with the case only know the Missing 411 version. But I'll keep it brief. Dennis Martin disappeared in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in June of 1969. He was visiting the park with his grandfather, father, and brother for a family reunion of sorts. The plan was to meet up at a place called Spence Field. Along the way, the Martins encountered an unrelated family with the same last name. They got along well, and the two groups decided to make the trek together. After arriving at Spence Field, Dennis disappeared after the group of kids hatched a plot to scare some of the adults by jumping out from behind trees. Unfortunately, Dennis was wearing a bright red shirt, so they told him to go a different direction than everyone else. He was never seen again. According to Missing 411, hours after Dennis disappeared, a man named Harold Key was in the park with his family in the Rowans Creek area. They wandered into the woods looking for bears. While out there, they saw a large, hairy man, or a man wearing animal pelts, running through the forest carrying something on its shoulder. This description seems to be inferring a Bigfoot or a wild man abducted Dennis Martin. Missing 411 claims Special Forces Green Berets showed up out of nowhere during the search for Dennis. It is said they carried weapons while they searched and did not communicate with any other searchers. Much of this information comes from an interview that Paulides and Bigfoot researcher Scott Carpenter did with Dennis Martin's father, Bill Martin. Paulides never interviewed the most important witness in this case, however, which was Harold Key, because he says he was already dead back in 2010 and 2011 when he was researching for his book. The exact quote is, "Most of the people involved in this case have retired or passed away. Mr. Key died in 2010. The problem with that story is that it is only accurate up until Dennis Martin disappears. Harold Key was actually alive up until 2019, and fortunately he was interviewed by a police officer named Michael Bouchard before that time. Harold Key stated that the man he saw in the woods that day was carrying nothing. There was no child being carried on anyone's shoulder, nor was the man he saw a Bigfoot or a wild man in animal skins. He said he saw a disheveled-looking man moving through the forest and then getting into a white vehicle and driving out of the area with haste. Shortly thereafter, he said he heard someone scream the word help, and then heard an agonizing scream of pain. This version of the story can actually be verified by contemporary newspaper articles where Harold Key was interviewed and said the man he saw left in a white car. Bigfoots and wild men generally don't drive, as I understand it. Besides that, we know that the Green Berets arrived at the request of the Park Service because they were training in the nearby area of Nantahala, and they received permission to help. This record has existed and been available for a long time. As of 2024, there are also many photographs that show the Green Berets during the Dennis Martin search, and not a single one is shown carrying a weapon. If you want more detail than this, I suggest you check out my past videos on the Dennis Martin case. Essentially, everything about the case that appeared strange and unusual turned out to be incorrect. To sum up, this disappearance was considered a keystone case in the Missing 411 catalog, but in the end, when you look at all of the facts, it appears that Dennis was either kidnapped by the disheveled man, which would mean criminal activity and disqualify this case, or Dennis got lost and died from exposure. None of those options make the case worthy of a moniker such as unexplainable or paranormal. Let's move on to something else. I know many people are probably familiar with Missing 411 because they watched the movies. Perhaps you're wondering what, if anything, is wrong with those. I don't want to go over every case in each movie because that would take some time, but let's just say that the movies aren't exempt from this problem. Don't get me wrong, I think Missing 411 The Hunted is a beautifully made movie. I've watched it many times. It's very well made from an artistic standpoint, but in terms of telling accurate stories, I think it can be seriously lacking in some areas. I'll briefly touch on some things from each movie. For the first Missing 411 movie, I remember watching it right when it came out, and even then I felt like it didn't really capture the essence of what Missing 411 was. I think the only truly mysterious case presented in it was that of Jared Atadero. The main focus was on Dior Coons Jr., in a case that I feel has a lot of indications of foul play. It's still being investigated to this day. Another case brought up in the movie was that of Bobby Bizup, a boy who disappeared while attending a Catholic camp and whose partial remains were later found. There is strong evidence to indicate that Bobby was the victim of some very evil camp counselors. The case is still being investigated to this day, and media has provided updates in the case as recently as 2022. This case should not have been included due to criminal activity. With regard to Missing 411 The Hunted, there's really two cases that I want to point out to this movie. Stanley Vigil Jr. is the first. If you watch the movie, it tells Stanley's story something like this. In 2017, he was out on a hunting trip with his father and friends when he spotted a deer as they were driving around in the truck. Stanley jumps out of the truck, chasing the deer. Bad weather rolls in, and Stanley never returns. A search is initiated, but it is unsuccessful. Then Stanley is eventually found dead in the Pecos River months later. This is all suggesting that we have no idea what could have possibly happened to Stanley. It makes it sound like Stanley just ran out of the car and vanished into the woods before showing up dead. That would be pretty mysterious, but this is only a fraction of Stanley's story. Before disappearing, Stanley was in the truck drinking with the other men. Maybe a minor detail, but still potentially important. The day after Stanley went missing, he actually showed up on the doorstep of a woman named Eumelia Gonzalez. Eumelia found him knocking on her door late at night, and she had no idea who he was. She said that he was armed with a 9mm pistol on his hip, and he told a story about his truck being stuck in the mountains and that men were chasing after him. Stanley asked to use her phone, but because Eumelia was scared, she told him he could not, and she then told him to leave, which he did. Later on, Eumelia would make contact with authorities where she identified Stanley Vigil as the man who knocked on her door. Canines were brought to her house where they were able to pick up his scent and track it for a while. Stanley was also likely captured by a number of game cameras after this incident, giving us some idea of his path of travel. Stanley's sister, Darcy Vigil, also believed that men were chasing her brother, and stated that police told her that his body had been found with head trauma and broken ribs. Darcy Vigil provided police with other testimony that she had seen surveillance tape of men appearing to chase someone who appears to be Stanley, hiding near a gas station. As far as I know, police never confirmed this report, so I don't give it the same weight as other evidence. I corresponded with Darcy back in 2023, and she still believes foul play was involved in Stanley's death, and she wants further investigation. But here's the point I want to make. If you had to guess what was going on in this case, what would it be? For me, I'd say either foul play or mental illness. Well, let's examine the missing 411 exclusionary criteria shown in this very movie. Again, the likely explanation falls within two exclusionary categories. It seems like this should not be considered a missing 411 case, but it's still in the movie. Alright, let's talk about Aaron Hedges briefly. I made a detailed video on the topic already, but if you're unfamiliar with the flaws in this case, I would suggest you go view it on my channel. Here is an abridged version as told in the movie. Aaron Hedges went hunting in the crazy mountains with two of his friends. Shortly into their trek, the group's pack mule bucked a bunch of Aaron's gear, including a sleeping bag, and it was all lost. Aaron had hidden a cache of gear at a place called Sunlight Lake, so he told his friends that he was going to leave and go get it. Aaron left, but stayed in radio contact with his friends for some time. In the last contact they had with him, he told them that he believed he had missed a turn and would not be back soon. Aaron's friends eventually shot an elk and then left the area without him. They told authorities that when they returned to the trailhead, they received a delayed text from Aaron saying that he would call them that night. A brutal snowstorm hits the area, and the search for Aaron eventually begins. They find a place he appeared to have stayed, with a fire pit, some gear, and his hiking boots. They don't find Aaron. His backpack and bow were later found located on the Rhine Ranch, further down the trail from where his campfire was found. It was resting against a tree, purposefully placed. Aaron's remains would be found a year later by guests from the Sweetgrass Ranch. There was not enough left of him to determine the cause of death. The sad truth of this story is that Aaron was quite an alcoholic. He had a serious problem. He was taking medication to help curb his drinking, but it appears it wasn't working very well. Witness testimony indicates that he went out on this hunting trip with a crazy plan to try and detox. Complications from alcohol withdrawal and a sudden snowstorm are what likely led to his death. There was also this other element of Aaron's hiking boots being found at the small campsite he made. I talked to this guy, who you might recognize from the movie itself. This is Sweetgrass County Sheriff Ronneberg. He told me that it's common for bow hunters to carry a spare set of hunting moccasins with them for stalking game. Sheriff Ronneberg said that he believed Aaron was wearing these moccasins instead. If you really look at all of the details of this case, nothing seems unexplainable about it. It's really just a tragic story. After my video on the subject was released, I've heard people say that perhaps Politis knew about the alcoholism, but decided not to say anything out of respect for Aaron and his family. That idea would be all well and good, but then you should not include it as a main entry in your movie. You can't omit a key element in explaining the case and then say the case is unexplainable. Sheriff Ronneberg said that he did an hour-long interview for the movie, which got whittled down to just a few minutes, which is normal, but I have a hard time believing that Ronneberg didn't bring up any of these key points at the time. In my opinion, Aaron's disappearance has clear signs of both voluntary disappearance, because he wanted to detox alone, and also mental illness in the form of addiction. It's pretty plain that both Stanley Vigil and Aaron Hedges should have been excluded from Missing 411 based on its own criteria. The key details of both of these cases are what's really missing in this movie. You might defend this by saying, well, maybe Paulides just didn't know. But the problem with that is that you're also saying this rather large production, a film that had an actual budget to go to all of these places and interview these people in person, does worse research than I do by myself from my own home. I don't even know what to think about that. I also want to mention that some people out there still say that David Paulides has never put forth an explanation for the cause of missing 411 cases, but I couldn't disagree more. In this movie they play the Sierra Sounds, which are famous purported Bigfoot vocalizations. Why would you play that in your movie about missing people unless you are making a connection there? After the Bigfoot sounds, the movie presents a case about UFOs and an invisible predator creature. Again, if you are trying to refrain from proffering an explanation for these cases, why would you present these unrelated incidents in the same movie? Did anyone watch those parts and come away thinking they weren't being presented as possible answers for the disappearances of people? Speaking of UFOs, let's talk about Missing 411, the UFO Connection. It's kind of right in the title with this one. If you watch this movie and still come away thinking Paulides hasn't offered any theories or explanations, I don't know what to say. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I found the movie in general to be pretty wacky with the whole aliens are coming here to steal our elk meat theory, but that's neither here nor there. I made a video on one of the cases featured in this movie, Mark Strittmatter. I won't criticize that too harshly because I know the police report wasn't available to him when he filmed that segment. Suffice to say that any theory that Mark Strittmatter was abducted by aliens was destroyed right around the time the movie came out, because his body was found in the same forest he disappeared in. The release of the police report showed that Mark found himself in a situation not unlike Aaron Hedges, only this time it was a combination of an opiate addiction and some really harsh inclement weather. I know I said I would try to avoid this, but I have to pick out some small inaccuracies that just surprised me, like misspelling the name of an individual who provided an interview on your film, or, in the case of Raymond Jones featured in the film, which, if you follow my channel, you know that Raymond wasn't abducted by aliens either. All evidence appears to indicate he was climbing a rock face when a piece of rock broke off and crushed him. But they show a supposed picture of Raymond in the movie, except that is not Raymond Jones. That is actually Raymond's neighbor. This picture was taken from a news article which interviewed some of Raymond's neighbors. But apparently nobody in the movie production bothered to check that it was actually the man they were covering in the film. Again, this is a film with a budget and multiple people working on it. It has a long list of credits at the end. It just feels like accurate information takes a second seat to atmosphere and presentation when it comes to these movies. Okay, it's time to conclude this video. Some might wonder if the cases I've discussed were cherry-picked. In a way, yes, some of them were. They were cherry-picked from a long list of cases I found to be inaccurate. Did I pick the ones I felt were the most egregious? Yes, I did. I did that for time purposes, and certainly to make a point. I did not cherry-pick the elevation and distance cases. Those two were just at the top of their respective lists. Again, there are cases in the Missing 411 catalog that are strange and have no obvious explanation, but those seem to be very few and far between. In my opinion, given this information, I can't reasonably conclude that there is a Missing 411 phenomenon. And just a reminder, I did not start out with that opinion. That opinion was built over time as more and more cases revealed a rational explanation. Why does Missing 411 have these errors? I don't know. I can only guess. I can only give you my opinion. When I consider it, the only things I can come up with are 1. The research that went into Missing 411 has been woefully inadequate. Or 2. There has been some sort of intentional deception. Again, that's just my opinion on the why, and I don't know which one of those it could be. But neither of them are a very good look. At this point, it's hard for me to believe that David Paulides has not been made aware of these errors. I have never heard him issuing any corrections to these cases that he has often presented. If he has, please send me the video. It's important because opinions should be adjusted as more information is gained. And if information comes out that makes a paranormal case seem rational, then that is not a bad thing. If we care about getting to the truth, then we should follow the evidence wherever it leads. even if we're disappointed in the outcome. To perpetuate information that is incorrect does not help the future of missing persons research. This isn't about being a believer versus being a skeptic. I don't think it's a good thing to be wholly dedicated to one or the other. It's about a balance. The moment I get good evidence of some paranormal happenings in a case, you better believe I would immediately make a video on that. I imagine there are some cases out there with paranormal indicators. There's definitely a number of cases that have no obvious explanation, but that's a different standard. The vast majority of cases have a rational explanation that is readily apparent. Hopefully, this has done something to explain where I'm coming from and why I have the outlook that I do. And for the people who comment that if it wasn't for Missing 411, I wouldn't have a job, maybe you're right. But if Missing 411 got it right the first time, we wouldn't need people like me either. So until next time, thanks for watching.